I'm just going to, for a minute, I'm just going to talk to you all briefly about my process of understanding Marxism. When I first got interested in communism, I was a utopian. I wanted to build an ideal world, and I saw the flaws in capitalism. I saw that a lot of bad things happen in our society because profits are in command. And I thought, shouldn't we organize society in a more rational way? I brought up in a religious household. The idea that communism and Christianity had some overlap was something that appealed to me, but I was a utopian. As I got older, I studied Marx and I studied these things, but I didn't really understand them. And I was in different Marxist groups. And, the way I started to understand, okay, we've got socialism, which is when there's public ownership of the means of production, there's a revolutionary government, and communism is the ultimate stage. And the way I understood socialism and communism was I thought that socialism is, when we take power, right? And then communism was just after people have learned to be good long enough, we've trained them to be good, they just get used to it, so then we don't need a government. I didn't understand it. It wasn't until the financial crash of 2008 that I really started to understand Marxism. It wasn't until the financial crash of 2008. I had been active in communist groups. I'd been in a Maoist group, and then I had joined the Workers' World Party. I'd been in the Workers' World Party for a couple years. I'd been briefly in this Maoist group before that, but it wasn't until the financial crisis that I really started to understand Marxism. And it was with the 2008 financial crisis, I learned that crisis was caused by overproduction. I read this book. This book was published by the political organization I was a member of. They read this book, Low Wage Capitalism, right? And it was all about how that with the high tech, with the technological breakthroughs that are happening, we're entering a long-term crisis of overproduction. So I read Low Wage Capitalism. And I was forced to understand concepts that are basic in Marxism, but Marxist groups don't talk about anymore. Overproduction, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. These kind of things are not talked about anymore. The idea is, well, capitalism is bad because the rich people have all the money and they do evil things to get their money, and so we're going to overthrow them. It's like, no, capitalism holds back growth. And the more technological progress advances, the poorer people get. Overproduction. The problem of overproduction, right? The problem of the fact that the workers can't buy back what they produce. The problem that technological leaps lead to greater poverty. These are things that I just started to understand in 2008. And then I started really reading the work of William Z. Foster. And I read The History of the Three Internationals by William Z. Foster, a great book. And in that book, they spend a long time talking about Lincoln and Marxist alliance with Abraham Lincoln, talking about the debates that Marx had with various figures around at the time, Ferdinand Lassalle and Louis Auguste Blanqui and other people, and then talking about the debates in the Second International and Edward Bernstein and revisionism and Karl Kautsky. And so it was really, I'd say about 2010 when I learned about how much the global Marxist movement had worked to support Lincoln. I learned how the Russian Revolution had happened, and I started saying things that kind of went against the standard Marxist narrative. I started to realize, well, the Second American Revolution, this U.S. Civil War, was a fight in the ruling class that opened the door to a wider struggle to defeat slavery. And that the Russian Revolution had started out as a fight within the ruling class. I read The History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union short course, this book. Right? And this is the official text history, the official history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, right? The history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union short course. Stalin wrote most of this book. He wrote most of it. He wrote the chapter on dialectical materialism, right? This book, I read it, and this is the official history of the Bolshevik Party. This was the official textbook in the Soviet Union on the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And I read this, and I read about the process that the Bolsheviks had gone through, the alliances that they made, the Kornilov reaction. And I read all of this, and I started to read. That's when I really started to grasp Marxism. I'd been in Marxist groups for 3, 4, 5 years at that point, and I hadn't really understood it. I hadn't understood the Marxist critique of capitalism. I hadn't understood the understanding of alliances. It wasn't until I came to understand the global financial crisis and its being rooted in overproduction. It wasn't until I read William Z. Foster and I studied about Marx and his relationship with Lincoln. It wasn't until I read this book and learned about how the Bolshevik Party had evolved over the years and how they had operated that I started to really understand Marxism. And that knowledge is a curse in some ways. You're better off not knowing. I would have been much happier in the Workers' World Party if I'd never known that. If I had never studied it, if I had been stupid, if I had just gone along with what they were doing, I would have been happier. But as I started to really understand Marxism, and I was active in this group, I started to realize they weren't really practicing it. They weren't really practicing it. And then in 2013, I went to Ecuador for the World Festival of Youth and Students, the global communist gathering. And then I met people and I said, this is the real thing. This is the real thing. I met communists from Vietnam. I met communists from Cuba. I met communists from Venezuela. I met communists from India. I met communists from North Korea. I met communists from China. And I was like, this is the real thing. This is the real thing. I've been to Venezuela now. I've been to Iran, a stronghold of anti-imperialism. I've spent a lot of time in Russia. I've spent a lot of time with the Russian Communist Party. The real thing is what I was learning. And it took me a long time to really understand the real thing. But until I started understanding the economics of Marxism, and until I started understanding Marxist methods, and then until I started to understand the way socialist countries in the world now are operating, I didn't really get it. And for a long time, I was stuck in this belief that if we could just go back to the pure Marxism of Stalin, if we could just do it how Stalin did it in the 30s when he was, doing the 5-year economic plans and industrializing and raising people out of poverty, and the Communist Party was a big party in the United States. If we could just go back to the 1930s, it would work. And visiting the socialist countries forced me to realize, no, that's not true. There's a reason that China had Deng Xiaoping theory and market reforms. There's a reason that Cuba wants to be more like China. There's a reason that Vietnam has market reforms. There's a reason that North Korea wants to be more like China, right? That 21st century socialism, Bolivarian socialism in Latin America, the socialism with Chinese characteristics they have in China, what they have in North Korea, the Juche ideology, all of this is a continuation of what was started. And what we have in the West, what we have in the United States now, has nothing to do with communism, right? The group I was in, the Workers' World Party, had heritage, and that's why they taught me about overproduction. That's why Fred Goldstein wrote this book, Low Wage Capitalism, and Sam Marcy wrote a book called High Tech, Low Pay. They had heritage. They had a historical link to that, to the Soviet Union and to China and other countries. The Communist Party has a historical link to that. The Socialist Workers' Party has a historical link to that. But the link cut off. Right? And nowadays, those groups are dying. The Communist Party is pretty irrelevant. The Workers' World Party is even more irrelevant. The Socialist Workers' Party is even more irrelevant. Right? But those groups at least had a link to that. But what started with the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 is very well alive today in China. It's very well alive today in Vietnam. It's very well alive today in North Korea. It's very well alive today in the Bolivarian countries of Latin America. And it's nothing like what people are doing in the West. And what people are doing in the West, leftism in the Western countries, has nothing to do with this. And that's why the people in the Western countries, bred to them, they all think it's fascist, because they don't understand actual socialism. Actual socialism exists today, and it has changed and evolved. But what started, and this is what you need to understand, is that Marxism has been gradually de-Westernizing itself. Marxism started out as a revolutionary current of Western intellectuals, people who were not satisfied with the French Revolution. It didn't go far enough. It didn't create a society that was egalitarian. So those guys in the pub, you ever watch Les Miserables? Those guys in the pub, do you hear the people sing? A lot of them weren't satisfied with the French Revolution. So they said, what went wrong? And Marxism came out of those pubs. And it came out of those young men who were idealistic and wanted to build barricades and sacrifice and were interested in ideas, those young rich kids who wanted to build some kind of egalitarian society, and they thought the French Revolution didn't go far enough. That's where Marxism started. And then Lenin took Marxism out of Europe. And Lenin started a party of new type that was not like the debating societies and the intellectual societies of Europe. And he started a party of new type. And he said that capitalism had entered its monopoly stage of imperialism, and the revolutionary energy was in the East rather than the West, and that Leninism was the first step of Marxism out of Europe. And then Lenin died, and Trotsky said the Soviet Union should focus on spreading communism to Europe. And Stalin said, that ain't going to happen. Let's build socialism in one country. And Stalin was another step out of Europe. And if you look at Mao in the Chinese Communist Party, they were doing a completely different thing. They were organizing the peasantry. The Bolsheviks had rejected organizing the peasantry. They said the industrial workers were revolutionary. But Mao went to the peasantry. And Mao developed methods of organizing that were uniquely Chinese and adapted to Chinese culture and Chinese tradition. And so Mao was another step out of Europe. And that now global Marxism has gotten really far out of Europe. It has nothing to do with Europe at this point. It's been completely Eurasianized. And that's why it doesn't look at all familiar to these Western kids. These Western kids, it doesn't look anything like what they think. If you go to Eurasia, which I have been to Eurasia, been to Iran, been to Russia, countries are rising up out of poverty. Societies are emerging with socialist economics and planned economies. And it does not look anything like the fantasy of those guys in the pub. Do we hear it doesn't look anything like that. Doesn't look anything like that. It's different. It's different. And that the Center for Political Innovation is a group of people who understand that it's different. And they like it. Basically, this is what you get of people in the world that are calling themselves Marxists, right? You have the bulk of people that realize it's different and they don't like it. They don't like really existing socialism because they realize it's different than the romantic, tear down everything, revolt, chaos philosophy, dialectical materialism you find in Marx. And they realize it's different and they don't like it. And then you have a layer of people that are trying to deny that it's different. Right? Like they say, well, and a lot of them they like Cuba, but maybe they don't like China. They like North Korea, but they don't. They're trying to deny that it's different. But the Center for Political Innovation is unique. We are unique in understanding among Western Marxists that it's different. But what they're doing in China today is different than what Marx was writing about. But we like what they're doing in China today. And we like that better. And that, yes, they understand certain objective laws of history that were taught by Marx. They draw heavily from Marx. They had an anime about Marx's life that they made, but they draw heavily from Marx. But yeah, what they're doing, it's a bit different. But it's actually happening. And what Marx was writing was just on paper. And often things happen in the real world very differently than they happen in theory. And that's what the Center for Political Innovation in the United States makes us unique. Around the world, we're not that unique. Communists in Africa sound like us. Communists in Asia sound like us. Communists in Latin America sound like us. But in the United States, we're pretty unique because we're not part of the current that admits it's different and hates existing socialism because it's different. And we're not in the part of the world that's, we're not in that minority of people that are like, well, maybe we can somehow admit that it's the same. No, we admit it's different. What they're doing in China today, what they're doing in Venezuela today, what they're doing in Vietnam today, what they're doing in Cuba today, and the Bolivarian countries today is different than what Marx wrote about. It is vastly different, but we like it. We like it. And we are learning from that. And that is what you need to understand. So there you go. I hope that that's educational for everybody. I hope that's helpful. But there you go.